Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here. I'll try to keep it interactive, but I thought what I will highlight for this group is, and most of you may already know that these things are happening, but really put in perspective what impact is mobile technologies going to have in the medical device industry, and really addressing the issue of how do you increase access to healthcare across the world while keeping a handle on the cost itself. So before I do that, I want to ask for your perspective, what do you think is behind the increase in cost in the healthcare system? And I'm sure all of you have very, very well-informed, diverse perspectives. So I'm just curious if people want to opine on what's behind the increase in cost. Third-party payers. Others. Increase in invasive procedures. Okay. Technology, do you want to elaborate? High cost of technology. Wages for healthcare professionals and hospital administrators. Okay. Availability of more therapies and more things you can do that adds to the cost. Yeah. Cost of regulatory procedures, yes. An aging population, absolutely. So, not enough focus on prevention. Yeah. So that's a pretty good sample of the kinds of things that drive the cost in the healthcare system, not only in the US, actually across the world. So I just took a crack at enumerating a few of these. And the ones that I want to focus on are what you already mentioned, the cost of devices and intervention itself. And really, where are you providing care and who's providing care? If you're providing care in a place like a hospital, that's pretty expensive. It's a high cost, fixed cost infrastructure. Anybody who walks in, you've already got a couple of $100, if not more, in cost. And if the people who are providing care are highly trained doctors, physicians, well, that's pretty expensive too. And then obviously devices themselves, some of the medical devices you see are fairly expensive. And I think the biggest distortion, and this is typical of the US market, not so much in other markets, that you don't really have a transparent quality or price signal in the market, right? Payers are not the same as the ones who are using the services, so it creates all kinds of distortions. And you don't really have an open market, right? I don't know if, what was the last time we were looking for healthcare and we could really shop around the way we'll shop for a car or other amenities. So these things have a way of distorting cost in the system. So what I'll focus on is one element of it. Why are the medical devices expensive? If you look at traditional companies that have been building medical devices, I think when they started out, and if they had computational needs, they had no choice but to do everything custom. So if you want to build a handheld device like GE does with vScan, well, you're probably doing custom screen, you're doing custom chips. All of these things are fairly expensive. And in order for you to sort of get to market, you go to a supplier like TI, Texas Instrument, and say, okay, well, can you build this for me? These people are used to building things in millions of volumes. So if you want something in a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand, I mean, that's pretty much most medical devices. You don't sell more than a few thousand a year. You're looking at a very high cost structure for doing those custom things. Obviously, if it's a medical device, you have to go through regulatory and processes. You can't really get away from that. I think that's the cost of doing business. The things that I want to focus on are the two distortions that come around, because historically, medical device companies have really taken the approach that they need to do everything custom, because that gives them more control, and they think they can get to market faster. And very often, there are gaps between your needs and what you can find in the market. But some of those things have changed in the last 5 years, and I'll allude to some of those changes that can be leveraged by companies like ours. The other piece is a lot of the adoption of medical devices came around driven by reimbursement. If you know the devices and the usage is going to be paid for handsomely, you don't worry about making these things expensive, because the way you're selling the devices is, well, you invest $1 million in this fancy infrastructure, you pay it off in 18 months, and then it's all profit for the next couple of years, right? And I think it's time to revisit some of that, because there's a tremendous potential in using devices to actually reduce cost and increase efficiencies. But that argues for a very different mindset and a different approach to designing those devices. And now contrast what's happened in medical device industry with what's happened in mobile industry. I think some of you remember 2005, you practically didn't have many people using smartphones. Most people, if they use smartphones, they use BlackBerries. And I think people in their 30s probably don't even know what I'm talking about if I mention BlackBerry or RIM. But the fact of the matter is, here's an industry that was driven by essentially consumer adoption and large-scale markets, and they were able to leverage Moore's law to get costs down very dramatically, improve performance, and at the same time open up a completely huge new market that people didn't even think existed. So just to put things in perspective, I think mobile phones, the number of mobile phones shipped across PCs in volume about a year and a half ago, and PC market used to be a huge market, right? And there are a couple of other interesting things happen in the mobile industry. Qualcomm came out with a chipset called Snapdragon in 2008, I believe, or 2009, somewhere around there. That was for the first time that you could get 1 gigahertz computing in mobile devices. Now, why that's interesting is when you hit that kind of computational capacity, you can start to do real-time imaging on the phone itself. So for all practical purposes, what you have in a phone and things that you're carrying, whether it's an iPhone or a Samsung or any of those, it's actually more powerful than a supercomputer of 14 years ago, right? And there's no reason why you shouldn't be looking at it to build some interesting, innovative medical devices. And there's a very fundamental difference in a phone compared to a PC. These are very personal things you're carrying on your person all the time, plus they have connectivity, right? So you can start to think of these devices not only as a way to monitor what an individual is doing, but also build some diagnostics around it, and I'll give you some examples of that. And then take all this information in real time and start to make sense for what's happening in real time across populations you're interested in. And I think you can imagine the epidemiology possibilities when you have infrastructure like that. And it also opens up a different kind of telemedicine. Traditional telemedicine has all been about having very high bandwidth networks that allow for face-to-face video. But I think here we can start to augment that paradigm by not needing high bandwidth video networks, but using the low bandwidth 3G or such networks, but on devices like this, what you're exchanging there is not face-to-face video, but physiological information and really what's happening with patients' bodies. So here are some of the examples of the kind of sensors people have developed in the last few years. So this is the kind of research I used to fund when I was at Microsoft, and I'm seeing most of these things come out in the market over the last year or so. So you can see some examples. There's a company called AliveCore. They have developed a single lead EKG, which is really a case that slides under your iPhone, and then you can do basic heart monitoring. You have a company called CellScope out of California. It's another company I used to fund when they were a research project in Berkeley. And they have developed essentially an attachment that will convert a phone into an otoscope, so you can look for ear infections. Another company out of University of Washington has developed a way to scan for retina to look for different conditions that can be detected as such. And then you have spirometers, oximeters, blood glucose, weight monitors, all kinds of things. The point is people have sort of woken up to this concept that you can have these very sophisticated sensors that connect to a device like this and get yourself a medical device, essentially, at a fraction of the cost, with some modalities that are fundamentally novel because you have connectivity. So how do these things come together? As I mentioned, the two big cost drivers in the healthcare system are where are you providing care and who's providing it. So to the extent you can move more care out of expensive settings like hospitals into clinics and eventually patients' homes, you start to reduce cost. And to the extent you can enable mid-level professionals, whether it's nurses, nurse practitioners, and eventually patients themselves, to manage more of that provision of care, you start to reduce costs as well. Now, in order to facilitate those transitions, you do need different kinds of devices because traditional medical devices for diagnostics, for monitoring, they have been designed to be used in hospitals by highly trained professionals. So to give you an example, if you want to go for an ultrasound exam, they will bring this huge cart-based machine. It's probably got 50 knobs and controls, and it will require training for about 3 weeks to really learn to master how to operate those knobs and controls, right? I mean, you can't have those kinds of devices if they're going to be used in a elder care facility or in patients' own homes to look for bladder volume or look for kidney issues and things like that. So at this point, I thought I'll transition and give you an example of how have we gone about it? What's our journey been like? Yesterday, I mentioned to the folks from the FDA, we were the first smartphone device to be cleared by the FDA, and that was quite a challenge, because the FDA had, we were very lucky that the team we worked with was absolutely very knowledgeable about ultrasound, and we had to sort of work with them to help them understand how smartphone fits into this picture. And the process itself was pretty expensive and long drawn, but I think now things are much easier because, as I mentioned those devices earlier, all of these things have gone through the FDA. So there is a set of devices that are now predicate devices. So if you're starting out now, you will have a set of predicate devices that you could claim substantial equivalence to. So things are a lot easier. So as Joe mentioned, I used to be at Microsoft. I didn't know anything about medical devices or imaging. I was funding research focused on developing tools that can leverage mobile technologies to improve access to healthcare, finance, and education. And so I funded a research project at Washington University in St. Louis with David Czar, and he developed the proof of concept that led to the product. What was interesting was every time we showed this proof of concept to people, we had a lineup of people who wanted to buy this. And we got tired of making excuses, and part of our brain registered, this is market validation, we should take it seriously. And then we got funding from 2 community clinics in Eastern Washington that got us going. So the main thing we wanted to look at is, can you have, and we've discovered a lot of research has already been done. Currently, if you want to do imaging, even in hospitals, you're looking at a typical wait time of 45 minutes. Even though they have a lot of devices, they actually have more needs for point-of-care imaging right where the patient is, rather than having to wheel in the devices or taking patients somewhere, right? And we thought, what is the impact if you had true point-of-care imaging right when you need it? And some of the data we discovered was pretty amazing. So an example here is, if you have a patient in ICU or NICU, and you have to move that patient for imaging, you're looking at a cost of $7,000 just for the move, because you have to untangle all the equipment they may be on, you have to have people who manage the process, and there are a whole bunch of things you have to manage, right? If you're doing line placement the traditional way, palpitating or landmark technique, you get it wrong, and you get pneumothorax infection, the cost of managing that complication can be $70,000. And that does not take into account any legal exposure you have because you have a bad outcome, and the fact that you have locked up the resources for which you're not going to be reimbursed because you're no longer reimbursed for hospital-acquired conditions. So when you think of the economic equation here, it's not about reimbursement at all. Because what are you going to get reimbursed for an ultrasound exam? Typically, it's $50 to $150. The impact on actually avoiding complication and improving efficiency is a lot bigger, right? So I think that's the main point I want to get across, that there is a huge opportunity here for building devices that can address the efficiency part of the equation. Yeah. And the other interesting things about ultrasound imaging, it's not radiation-based, so it's safe. And unlike radiation-based modalities, you can actually miniaturize this quite a bit. And actually, this is our first-generation device that we went to market with last year. Oh, thank you. And you can tell, it's got some interesting modalities. I can carry it in my pocket, and it's easy to use. The form factor is something we're working on, so don't get too worried about it. I get stopped a lot at customs and immigration whenever I go elsewhere. They're curious about this. So you can ask, why is it that ultrasound is not more broadly available in point-of-care setting? And there are 3 major issues. First, the traditional systems are very expensive, they're huge, and they're very complicated. And I think the issue of complexity probably dwarfs everything else. So what we did was we started with the smartphone. We use it as a computing platform. That's what we do. The smartphone does all the number crunching, the image formation, and the network communication. And we could do this because of the Qualcomm chips that I mentioned, right? Before 2008, it would have been technically impossible for us to do what we are doing. So these transitions are fairly recent, and that's why I think people haven't completely grasped the implications of these transitions. The other thing we focused on was, since this was going to be a point-of-care device, it had to be really, really simple to use. So we designed the user interface to be very straightforward. I can give it to any one of you here. I think in 5 minutes you'll learn by yourself how to operate the device. Not necessarily how to acquire good images, but you learn how to operate the device. And that's a pretty big simplification. And the other differentiator here compared to other handheld devices is we design around network connectivity. So it's not just the device that takes images. We can take the images off the device using wireless network, whether it's a cellular or Wi-Fi, and then manage those images for you. So down the road, we can provide you image management services that go with it. And that's a huge cost reduction, because if you have to manage images yourself, you're looking at paying tens of thousands of dollars for a PAC system, plus paying for machines and people to manage that. If the device comes with that, that's pretty attractive. And once you have images in the cloud, we can also give you services like 24/7 access to radiology over read, right? And that opens up interesting possibilities as well for ultrasound. It's already done in CT and MRI. Companies like Nighthawk provide overread services, and I think we can do the same with ultrasound. And that makes it a lot easier for you to do quality control audits and things like that. So is that a real market? Yeah. If you think about ultrasound market, everybody focuses on the top of the pyramid. That's the $4 billion market. It's been a $4 billion market for a very long time. And this is a traditional market where machines cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're like the craze, the supercomputers, beautiful machines. They can give you 4D imaging. You can see a 24-week-old fetus, in real time and make out all the gestures. I don't know what the diagnostic value of those things are, but presumably there is. So what a company like Sonosite did was they moved sort of down the pyramid a little bit. They made the devices more robust, cheap, a lot cheaper, and easier to use, and focused on emergency medicine folks. And that opened up a huge market. The company was acquired for $1 billion last year, and they had annual revenues of $250 million. I think what we want to do is take this one level further, improve the accessibility a lot, improve affordability a lot, and also play with different kinds of business models where people don't have to necessarily get this modality as a capital equipment, but can also take it as an operating expense, so where they're leasing through our partners. And then we are also providing them services to manage the whole imaging life cycle. We think that market is $1.7 billion annual market. And that's just within the United States and Europe.
You're going to be rich, man.
Well, you got checks to write? and what's also interesting is that each section of the pyramid, the basis of competition is very different. If you are going to sell to the top of the pyramid, you have to compete with those massive, wonderful machines. And that's very difficult for an outsider to come in and compete with. So we are focused on the underserved market, where our current competition is people are either not using ultrasound imaging at all, they're doing guesswork. So for line placement, they're trying to palpitate or use landmarks. It's a fancy way of saying try to figure out where the vein is before you stick something in, right? And we're giving you imaging where you take the guesswork out of that. Or we're focused on segments where currently there's a lot of resource contention, where there are so many hurdles before you can get hold of an imaging device for your purposes. And that's in the point of care settings in hospitals. So I think that's very critical. If you are going to go in this market, you really want to make sure the segments you go after, you have some advantages, and incumbents can't just destroy you, because you don't want to play by their rules necessarily. So what does that mean, from a systems perspective? Essentially, if you have very expensive equipment, you have only a few institutions and few people in those institutions that can afford it. So hospitals, you're looking at thousands. If you change the affordability, you can target providers like doctors. That's an order of magnitude. But if you improve this even further, now you're talking about nurses, nurse practitioners, and eventually healthcare workers. That's a pretty big market. Now you're looking at consumer electronics style market here, right? That's a pretty different way of thinking about medical devices. And this, if you have been in the medical device industry, the timeline here would come as a surprise to you. And I think that's another element. If you're able to leverage consumer electronic technologies, I think you can shrink your time to market pretty dramatically, not to mention the cost of goods and the operational infrastructure you have to put in place. So we started in December 2009. We prepared our FDA submission very early in 2010, got it in January 2011, and we launched in November 2011. So it was 18 months from the time we were a proof of concept through the FDA and in the market. That's that's quite dramatic for a medical device. So, and I think part of it is that we really focused on leveraging existing infrastructure, not having to design from scratch. And that's an opportunity a company 5 years ago didn't have. And we were fortunate that our timing from a technology perspective was pretty good. And then this is an evolving device. So the beauty of it, I can keep offering better quality, better image quality, better resolution, more or less for free. So last month, we launched a tablet-based product. Now, a tablet gives you 4 times larger screen, twice the resolution, higher frame rate, so you can do even more interesting cardiac imaging. And I didn't have to do a lot of work. I had to essentially port my software stack to work on a different platform, right? And my FDA clearance was for both of those devices. So I'm getting this leverage from an industry that's investing tens of billions of dollars in improving the platform. And I can essentially offer the same benefits to my customers for better image quality, and as these devices get cheaper, I can pass the savings on to you as well. So that's a pretty interesting dynamic to be able to leverage. And and how that translates if you're trying to build a company or a business is your capital needs are significantly lower. Without giving the numbers, I can assure you I have raised an order of magnitude lower capital than a typical medical device company at my stage would have. Okay, and it wouldn't have been possible if I had done it the standard way. And because this is kind of crossing boundaries between consumer electronics, medical, and ultrasound imaging, you do have to pay attention to what sorts of people you have to have on board. It is not a very traditional team that you bring on board. You have to bring different perspectives. So this gives you an idea of the kind of people we have on board. So Marcus Smith, he was the CFO of Sonosite. He was the one who did the $1 billion deal with Fuji, and Sonosite knows the ultrasound industry really, really well. So he's our CFO and Senior VP of Corporate Development. David Czar was a PI at WashU, and he's been working on ultrasound technologies for 20 plus years. So you really need that deep technical expertise on ultrasound. And then Jeff Baker, he comes from point of care selling background. He was with Epocal and iStat, where they figured out how to sell point of care blood diagnostics into hospitals. So again, you need that perspective. And then our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Youngren, he was in the US Army for more than a decade, and he pioneered the use of ultrasound by medics in the battlefield to be able to do quick look and triage, and how do you train people to use technology like this to really help improve their efficiency and effectiveness in the field. And that's pretty important because some of the markets we are going after have exactly the same characteristics. And then my background is really in the software industry, but doing a lot of new product services, turnarounds, and such. So I think together we are able to get our heads around some of the problems we have to deal with. It also helps if you're the first one to do something that people think is science fiction. Where it helps is you get a lot of very interesting media exposure. Most people think we must have $1 million marketing budget, I assure you, and Joe knows that, we don't. But the story is compelling, right? People see devices like this, they can see, yep, that's where the healthcare industry is going to go, and that's the kind of impact it'll have. So we also won a fair number of awards, national as well as international. I think part of this evolution is inevitable. If it wasn't us, it would have been someone else. You can see this in the industry after industry. I give an example of the computing industry because that's what I know best. You had large mainframes, then you got minis, laptops, and now we have things that fit in the pocket. Similar things, you can join the dots in the ultrasound imaging industry as well. You had the mainframe equivalent, large card-based systems, then you had the laptop-style things from Sonosite, and you have devices like ours, right? So this is pretty inevitable, and what's important is when these transitions happen, with every jump in form factor and affordability, you're talking about opening up a fundamentally new market that's a lot bigger than the traditional market, and your customer base expands. It's not the traditional users, these are newer users you didn't even think existed. So this is a classic Clayton Christensen innovator's dilemma, if you're familiar with that those kinds of innovations really, and as in the computing industry, every time we had a change of paradigm, the leaders in the new paradigm are not the same as the leaders in the old paradigm. So there's opportunity for new companies to get started, even though when you look at regulatory environment, the financing environment, it can be pretty depressing. But fact of the matter is, you can still get things done and create a lot of value. And the world does catch up with you eventually. So you just have to have enough patience and foresight to hang in there. And I want to leave you a couple of examples. How are we doing on time, Jared? Okay, so I'll give you some examples of why I think this is becoming a large trend, and it's not just a couple of isolated companies. If you're familiar with TEDMed, it's a medical conference that brings in the thought leaders from around the world. And the last one took place in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. And they set up a booth called Smartphone Physical, where they had medical students essentially doing a complete physical exam using technologies that worked on the smartphone itself. So I'll just take you to the website so you have a sense. Right. And I'll show you some of the devices. This is an example of the blood pressure monitor. Where is that? Okay. I am feeling a little bit challenged here. Give me a second, please. For a former Microsoft person, I should know better, right?
What an embarrassment.
Okay. So some of the devices I showed you, actually, let me just go back again. Hopefully I'll know better to navigate. If not, I'll do what I did before. Okay, so you can see there's a way to measure what's happening in your eye, being able to do, actually do a complete eye measurement. Let me just go there. So instead of going to ophthalmologists where they have this massive machines, they have figured out a way to compress it down to a very tiny form factor. And you can see the implications for emerging markets, smaller clinics, right, who you can't afford these sorts of devices. This one you can carry, do the exam right away. It works beautifully. So let me then go to something else here. And then you have companies like Qualcomm that make the chips that go in your cell phone. They have launched this thing called the X-Prize, the tricorder X-Prize. So the idea here is if you're familiar with Star Trek, they have the small devices that they scan and tell you what's wrong with you. And Qualcomm thinks that's actually feasible today with a little bit of innovation. So they have a $10 million prize, and it's open to companies, research groups who come up with a way of capturing in a very small factor, a small form factor, a phone-based form factor, a way to determine what's wrong with someone by essentially non-invasive measurements. Right, and there are some serious teams that are competing in this prize. So you can tell that in a couple of years, even if nobody wins the prize, it'll drive a whole series of innovation in making diagnostics easier. And then, I'll show you a video that was featured at TED Intel. So Intel organized a TED-style event internally, and Eric Dishman, who is the head of all of the healthcare initiatives for Intel, he demonstrated how technologies like ours could be used to enable more of the healthcare to move out closer to the patient. So rather than me explaining, let me jump into the video. And I'll show you just a clip and not the whole thing. That's odd. I'll scan to the place in a moment.
I want to share some personal friends and stories with you that I've actually never talked about in public before to help illustrate the idea and the need and the hope for us to reinvent, who just take it and don't ask any questions. Now, the problem with this model is that it's unsustainable globally. It's unaffordable globally. We need to invent what
Oops. He's mostly critiquing why the existing system doesn't work. I think the network here is not too happy.
I call a personal health system. So what does this personal health system look like and what new technologies and roles is it going to entail. Now, I'm going to start by actually sharing with you a new friend of mine, Libby, somebody I've become quite attached to over the last 6 months. This is Libby, or actually this is an ultrasound image of Libby. This is the kidney transplant I was never supposed to have. Now, this is an image that we shot a couple of weeks ago for today, and you'll notice on the edge of this image there's some dark spots there, which is really concerning to me. So we're going to actually do a live exam to sort of see how Libby's doing. This is not a wardrobe malfunction. I have to take my belt off here. Don't you in the front row worry or anything. I'm going to use a device from a company called Mobisante. This is a portable ultrasound. It can plug into a smartphone. It can plug into a tablet. Mobisante is up in Redmond, Washington. And they kindly trained me to actually do this on myself. They're not approved to do this. Patients are not approved to do this. This is a concept demo, so I want to make that clear. All right, I got to gel up. Now the people in the front row are very nervous. And I want to actually introduce you to Dr. Batuk, who's another friend of mine. He's up in Legacy Good Samaritan Hospital in Portland, Oregon. So let me just make sure. Hey, Dr. Batuk, can you hear me okay? And actually, can you see Libby?
Hi there, Eric. You look busy. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just taking my clothes off in front of a few hundred people. It's wonderful. So I wanted to see, is this look the image that you need to get? And I know you want to look and see if those spots are still there.
Okay. Well, let's scan around a little bit here. Give me a lay of the land.
All right.
Okay. Turn it a little bit inside, a little bit toward the middle for me.
All right.
Okay. That's good. How about up a little bit? Okay. Freeze that image. That's a good one for me.
All right. Now, the last week when I did this, you had me actually sort of measure that spot to the right. Should I do that again?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right. This is kind of hard to do with one hand on your belly and one hand on measuring, but I've got it, I think, and I'll save that
Okay.
image and actually send it to you. So tell me a little bit about what this dark spot means. It's not something I was very happy about.
Many people after a kidney transplant will develop a little fluid collection around the kidney. Most of the time it doesn't create any kind of mischief, but it does warrant looking at. So I'm happy we've got an opportunity to look at it today, make sure that it's not growing, it's not creating any problems. Based on the other images we have, I'm really happy that how it looks today.
All right, well, I guess we'll double check it when I come in. I've got my 6-month biopsy in a couple of weeks, and I'm gonna let you do that in the clinic because I don't think I can do that one on myself.
Good choice.
All right, thanks, Dr. Batuk. All right, so what you're sort of seeing here is an example of disruptive technologies, of mobile, social, and analytic technologies. These are the foundations of what's going to make personal health possible. Now, there's really 3 pillars of this personal health I want to talk to you about now, and it's care anywhere, care networking, and care customization. And you just saw a little bit of the first 2 in my interaction with Dr. Batuk.
Okay. So you get a sense for what's possible, right? I mean, if you were in a research environment 5-10 years ago to make that demo possible, you would have spent a fortune to do real-time remote ultrasound, right? And we could do that with commodity electronics, no setup at all. Just
Who else in this room just wants to clap right now? Was that awesome?
thank you. And then, there are also organizations like HIMSS and NIH who are taking this trend pretty seriously. The mHealth Summit started a couple of years ago. NIH was a sponsor. Now HIMSS has taken over because it's become so big. And this is one of the best forums that brings together not only innovators, the policymakers, regulators, and companies. And it just keeps growing. So this is a pretty real trend and worth taking seriously. So I'll wrap up so we can do some Q&A. I think there's going to be a completely new generation of medical devices. What I showed you is the first wave, but there'll be very interesting things coming down the road. They will be designed for a different use model and a totally different business model as well. Reimbursements will play less of a role. It'll be about improving efficiency and increasing access. And quite frankly, it's an opportunity for newer companies to play, because I don't think the established players would be as actively involved in the early stages, because it's a different business model. And that's good. I think eventually a lot of these companies will acquire smaller companies, but the discovery and the development of the market will probably be led by startup companies. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, it keeps everything very dynamic. So happy to take questions.
That was awesome, man.
Don't you love Joe as a cheerleader?
Hey, Colin Cater from, well, I'm going to ask you the question as a Navy engineer. The defense, have they started acquisition at all? Defense.
Well, so
Department of
we
Defense.
are under trials at places like Madigan. We have talked to folks at Fort Detrick. I th-
How about the Navy?
We haven't had any direct contact with Navy yet, but
Can we
there-
talk later?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Something to keep in mind if you're a small company and you have to do business with the government, you have to get on GSA schedules, very expensive, painful. So you're better off finding a company that already is on schedule, and they can, yeah. Unless you have special ops guys, they can work around a whole bunch of things. Yes. Other questions?
And I'm Joe Bjorklund, Sailesh. We actually have run in very parallel circles in our careers. I was a part of the early management team at Sonosite,
Oh, okay.
and also ultrasonics. But I wanted to ask you, because one of the things you're going to face, and I'm sure you already have faced, is you have to manage expectations all at the same time while really working against some heavy headwinds. And what I'm really wondering about is how have you gone about, obviously when you come with a whole new paradigm like this, there's a real establishment that's going to push back when it comes to, there's a lot of money in ultrasound education, there's a lot of existing money in the current paradigm in terms of wanting to push certain image quality. How have you managed the expectations and really the perception that there's a lot of interest in the market to identify this as a toy
Yeah.
and not as a true clinical device? I'm just curious how you've gone about that.
No, I think that's a great question, and it's something we grappled with when we started, and we have grappled with, and it's helped us figure out how to position ourselves in the market. So we're very careful in being upfront, saying this is not a replacement for your existing high-end infrastructure. It's not a replacement for those $100,000, $50,000 machines, but it's giving you imaging where your current choices are limited imaging or no imaging whatsoever. So it's really point-of-care imaging, and it's focused on quick look and triage and guided procedures. Right, so if I go back to the slide here, just a moment. So I think this slide is pretty critical, right? And if we played in the first or the second level of the pyramid, we'll lose. That's a game we can't win, right? Because GE or Sonosite can throw a lot more money. But what we find is there is a pretty underserved segment out there. So an example would be, PIC lines, central lines. Nurses are the ones doing these procedures. And you want to make sure every one of them has a device that allows them to get it right the first time. It's very difficult to justify a $40,000 commitment for each nurse or doctor in the hospital. But if you're looking at sub $10,000 devices, that's a very different game, especially if you make it also easy to manage images in the whole process. So no, you're absolutely right. If you play in the top two layers of the pyramid, it'll play out very predictably. The big companies will essentially make it very difficult, if not impossible, for us to win. And we're being very careful in not doing that. So.
One, fabulous. I think it's a great idea. So here's my question. Who pays for it today? And so the patient had it, and he was sent the image to the doctor. Are the doctors going to read it if they're not getting paid to read it? What's the liability, and then how are you dealing with HIPAA issues?
So the first thing I should mention is that was a proof. It was a proof of concept that's not how the device is being used today. It's sold only to medical professionals. Okay, so it's a regulated device. It's not sold to consumers. It's sold to medical professionals. Because it's ultrasound, you can use the existing CPT codes. We didn't have to get new CPT codes. So if reimbursement is important, and a lot of physician practices, it is important. That's how there's no issue. If you're in a hospital environment, you're already under DRG system, right? So that's how the payments get done. But it's a standard ultrasound device. There's no difference. And there are a subset of things that, for example, we don't have color Doppler. So there are CPT codes relevant to color Doppler procedures that don't apply, but for standard B-mode ultrasound, all the regular CPT codes apply.
Sailesh, I think your innovation and ingenuity is mind-blowing, and I think you're building markets in a very amazing way. I wanted to ask you, have you looked at this in the context of combining the imagery with a geographic information system? And do you see any specific applications for that? I was thinking, tumors, storing tumors on a geospatial mapping array, potentially, in terms of tracking types of disease. What do you
So,
think?
so you know, a lot of our IP is around those areas. So I can't give you a lot more details, but absolutely. I mean, that's what connectivity enables you, right? Not only do you have information in real time with, you know, the imaging related, but the device is capturing a whole bunch of other data. It's location data, other data. And we thought very deeply about what will be interesting ways of leveraging the connectivity. And I think for epidemiology, that becomes very relevant. But to get there, you have to have enough presence in the market. You have to have enough of these sensors out there that are being used by providers, right? So, but I would say 3 or 4 years from now, that will be the way you track diseases because you have people doing stuff in the community. Yeah.
I didn't introduce myself before. My name is Dov Gal, and I'm here as a consultant doing clinical research and regulatory affairs for medical device companies. So I have a question and a comment. 15 years ago, I was involved with a company with very, very innovative approach, basically using electromagnetic field adopted from pilot cockpit technology in order to guide biopsies using ultrasound. And the challenges that we faced were, it took us 5 years after we started commercialization. And challenges I'm asking you, have you addressed them, are training and the liability issues. Because you're attracting a market, if I understand correctly, where ultrasound expertise is not the highest. So how are you going to ensure that images that are taken by people using your system are interpreted in the right way? There are a lot of liability issues there. The other thing that we faced was the challenge of getting from the early adopters into the broader market. So if you have addressed these two issues in your plan, that's the question. Another comment is with the mobile health moving forward, I can see how if you could design applications where you have a probe that is fixed on certain areas, then you can transmit data from patients using telemedicine. And have you thought about that?
Yeah. Okay. No, great question. So I think your first question was around training, product liability. So there are 3 levels of complexity in ultrasound, right? One is how do you operate the device? How do you do the right thing to acquire diagnostically useful images for what you're trying to do? And the third bit is how do you make sense of what the images are telling you? The third one is the hardest. And you'll always need extensive training in the foreseeable future. You know, with doctors or radiologists will have to do that, sonographers. We have solved the first problem, made it really easy to operate the device. There's a huge group of people who are solving the second problem. How do you develop very simplified acquisition protocols? And we're not talking about being able to do broad range of diagnostics. If I want to teach someone how to distinguish abscess from cellulitis, that's not a very complicated training protocol, right? Because you're looking for fluid. Fluid lights up very nicely. So that's what, when we talk about training the mid-level professionals, we're talking about taking very targeted, very narrow procedures. And the training for that is a couple of hours, and then some number of supervised procedures, and then you check off. And different hospitals have different requirements before they'll let their professionals use ultrasound, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of being able to diagnose things, that I think in the foreseeable future, you will need experts. Where our device helps is, if you have standardized image acquisition protocols, then a remote expert, a radiologist, could do that for you. They could do the diagnosis. We ran this experiment last year. We had a group take our device in Sierra Leone, and they screened about 300 patients there. And we set up an overreach services to the radiologist at a hospital in Seattle. And 12 of those patients were referred for an expert opinion, and I think 3 of them were taken for an emergency intervention that saved their lives. Right? So the model actually works quite well. When you have connectivity, you can leverage the fact that the expertise you need for diagnosis may not be present where you are. Right? So, and there are companies now that focus on training all kinds of professionals, and there are fellowships out there. In fact, our chief medical officer, he used to run a training organization like that, and he trained the medics in the army. So we have, but it is a pretty significant issue you have to handle, but we don't have to do it on our own. I think there's a partnership we can create with other companies. And that's an advantage that I think a Sonosite didn't have when they started. They actually created all the training materials. So we are piggybacking off the things people have already done. Important when you're a startup. You don't have unlimited resources. You have very finite resources. So.
Morning, Sailesh. Todd Staples, we haven't been introduced yet, but I'm a sales and marketing channel consultant. I deal with startups like yours all the time. I think it's really exciting, the product that you have. I think what excites me more about the product than anything else is the fact that you're doing a lot of the innovation in the approach in the business model. So business model innovation is every bit as important as technology innovation, in my opinion. So how you implement that and how you disrupt the market with that is really a huge factor, I think, in your ultimate success. In my opinion, I think you're probably maybe even a year early. So it may take you another year before you really get the traction you want, but it's just awesome to see that you're so on.
Well, we haven't solved all the problems or discovered all the answers. I think what I can assert with some confidence is we are as likely, if not more likely, than anyone else to get there because we are in the market, right?
Yes.
This is what we live and breathe. There's no other distraction. We don't have large businesses to worry about cannibalizing, and we live and die by this, right? So if we don't sell, don't succeed, there is no paycheck.
Yeah. So the
So
question.
there's a lot of motivation to make this work.
Absolutely. Well, I have a lot of questions, but I'll just limit it to one. With so much emphasis on a startup and getting that initial traction you need to get the attention, get the revenues built up quickly, all the issues in the U.S. with the FDA and HIPAA compliance and all the other things, there's a large population worldwide of patients that are managing chronic illnesses from home that could benefit from this technology, just like you showed in the video. Why the U.S. as an initial entry?
Well, so when I started the company, my initial focus was emerging markets. I used to run businesses for Microsoft outside of US, so I had a realistic idea of how difficult that is, and learned very quickly that for medical devices, the level of complexity is even higher. You have to not only worry about IP issues, you have regulatory issues, you have to have connections with the local healthcare ministries, you need to know the politics. It's very complex. So as you go deeper, you find it's not the ideal answer when you're starting out. And the second thing is we would have to be there locally. If I was going out to the Chinese, Brazilian, or the Indian market, I would have to essentially move there and make sure we are in that context, right? Otherwise, it's very hard to do things remotely. Just sending people for one business trip takes away your margins. So we sort of stepped back and decided to focus on the US market because of that. And we also discovered there are a lot of underserved niches in the US market that are very attractive. So the whole guided procedure, and I'm happy to give you more details offline. We found lots of niches that are underserved, that are very attractive, that we can serve adequately today and well today. And then that gives us revenue streams, that gives us economies of scale, that allows us to build up more clinical evidence base. All of these things are going to be critical as we are ready to go international. And the other thing we'll hold off for going international is finding the right partners who have the ecosystem understanding and the relationships. And they will have a vested interest in making sure IP doesn't walk out of the door.
Terry Mandel, BioMedLink, improving access to affordable biomedical innovation in the developing world. Thank you. Perfect segue. I had a similar question. If the underserved markets you were looking at were, of course there's lots of niches yet in the developed world, and the developing world obviously is a much, much bigger opportunity in terms of numbers. My question had to do with whether you felt, and it sounds like you do, that at some point your pricing structure or your financing mechanisms will make it possible to really work in very, very low resource settings, because now, as you know, 85 to 90% of the world is already able to connect.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I think the two things we'll have to get there. One will happen, which is that as our volumes and market presence increases here, we'll be able to reduce prices further and make the product portfolio more robust and complete, have some of the functionality that's needed. The second piece I don't control, but I think it actually holds the field back. A lot of organizations, the NGOs that cater to the underserved community, they're very used to having everything given to them for free, which means that if you're a company trying to build products to serve the market, you're out of luck, right? So that's a dynamic that I think will have to change. Because if it doesn't change, there's nothing that companies like ours can do to really serve those markets. Yes, absolutely.
Hi, Tom Kramer from Kablooey Design. I wonder if you could comment on two hurdles that you may have had to encounter when you were on this journey. The first is that Apple doesn't allow any medical device apps to be written for their devices. And then the second question is, how difficult was it to get HIPAA-sensitive data, to get the FDA to allow you to have HIPAA-sensitive data on the cloud?
So we don't work on iOS today for precisely the reason you articulated. Actually, the technical limitations, currently iOS doesn't have support for USB host, and we need that, so that's number one. Now, we have a way to work with Apple devices down the road that we are working on, because that's an important class of devices in the US market at least. The other thing, in order for us to get through the FDA, we had to establish that we are HIPAA compliant. So we had to show, and we are. I mean, there's a lot of security that you have to manage properly. We don't have the cloud yet. That's something we are working towards as part of our next product rollout, if you will. But we have the ability from the device to send the data in a HIPAA compliant, secure manner to either a system that can archive it or to a person who can provide you with overread. So that works out of the box today. And it's completely HIPAA compliant.
Hi, just a simple question. Are you looking at other sensor modalities to integrate and to supplement the ultrasound?
Yes, absolutely.
Ooh, pardon me. So excited, I knocked over her coffee. Hold on a second. I wasn't counting on a one-word answer. Here you go, Terry.
Great presentation, Terry Maton, Gyroscope.
I just had my FDA audit last year, so I've become trained in giving yes and no answers and then keeping my trap zipped.
Great presentation. You showed a slide earlier, which was very interesting, showing how you're expanding the concentric circles, right? So to the extent you have white space there, you have nurses, and I assume that you looked at EMT workers potentially in that kind of care setting. What I'm curious about is when you have people like Vscan as a competitor, what sort of thought process, without going into any great details, do you have about how you consider your product pricing? So do you don't have the money to go into extensive HEOR studies or that sort of thing, but what sort of inputs do you use?
Okay, so you asked me a couple of related questions here. How are we competing with Vscan? That was number one. So one thing I have to say, if you're a startup company and you have a big company that goes in the market with products that look like they're solving the same problem, that's actually a good thing. It validates the market. I mean, there's no way I would take out Super Bowl ads or Winter Olympic ads GE would, right? And that's wonderful. So before GE launched the Vscan, it took me a lot longer to explain to people what we are trying to do. Afterwards, it was much simpler. And it's a pretty big market, right? So I don't think having big players is a bad thing. I think it's actually a good outcome. The approach is very different, though. I mean, GE is still building those devices in a traditional manner. They have to worry about self-cannibalization. Although in the emerging markets, that's less of a factor. I'll give you specific examples. A Vscan, you have only one transducer frequency, and that's fixed, right? We can swap transducers. We support 4 or 5 different kinds of transducers that cover the complete clinical range because we think it should be a solution by itself. Vscan doesn't have network connectivity built in, so that, but I think so. It's just a very different approach to the market, and I'm sure they'll get to the answer as well. But if you are a smart, ambitious engineer in GE, chances are you want to work in high margin product units, right? I mean, this is a very classic dynamic. And so we're counting on some of those factors to play out. But it's a good thing that GE has validated the market. I think that helps, absolutely.
I'm Carl Rosner, CardioMag. You've done a great job in explaining all of the pitfalls that you had to overcome. But since Sonosite seems to be a leader and they already are acquired for $1 billion, don't you think that within the next year or two somebody will approach you with an offer that you can't refuse?
Yeah. Why not? That would be fine by us. So the follow-up question was, what are we doing with medical societies? So we are in the process of identifying a small group of people with whom we'll engage with. I mean, we are reaching out to radiologists, sonographers, all kinds of societies, absolutely. Because you have to bring the ecosystem along, and having good relationships is critical.
So the final question is mine.
Okay.
You're a part of our medical device group family. We're part of your inaugural graduating class from 10X, and I think I speak on our behalf. Collectively, can we give you some money and be your investors and just ride this fantastic innovation of yours with you?
So yeah, okay, so I think I'll interpret that as saying, okay, where are we on the financing side? Is that what you're asking?
No, I want to give you my money, and I want to get rich with you. That's my question. Can I do that, and can they do that?
If you are an accredited investor and you're willing to write checks of $50,000 or above, we're happy to chat with you.
I'm going to need to borrow some money from you guys. Sailesh Chutani, thank you very much.
Thank you.